I invite everyone to turn in their Bibles to the book of Daniel. So we're going to be at a very familiar story. We're not going to be in the second half of Daniel. That's where you have the prophecies and the visions. We will not wade into that on a Sunday morning, at least not with any kind of depth, because that's more of a kind of a Wednesday night discussion, and obviously a time and place for that. But we'll be in the first few chapters of the book of Daniel, kind of discussing a story that I believe is pretty well known. This is one of the first stories that at least I remember reading about was the story of the fire furnace with Shadrach, Meschach, and Abed-Nego. I remember the biggest challenge I had at that time was actually pronouncing those names when I was, second or third grade. But the story over time has developed into a really powerful story of faith. If you, I don't want to say ignore, but if you kind of look past the Bible class applications that we sometimes have of it, and you really do think about what these men went through in that time period, I think there's a whole bunch of applications that I think you can pull out of this. It's really a story on standing firm in temptations and trials anyways. And I'm always envious and I'm jealous and I emulate these types of people who can go through really intense persecutions, really intense fires, and not only go through it, but end up somehow better on the other side. Not that anyone would go through one of those trials willingly, but somehow end up better on the other side. There's a fantastic illustration of one of the very first full-length accounts that we have of a martyr in the first century by the name of Polycarp. And Polycarp was not a disciple of John. He learned about Jesus from John the Apostle. He's a follower, obviously, of Jesus. But it's one of the most complete accounts that you have of a person standing through persecution, literally in the middle of the hottest part of the persecution of the Roman Empire. And as they dragged Polycarp, who was in his 80s at this point, which is an elderly man for that time period, he shows up at this massive Colosseum, and he's so resolute in his desire to die for Jesus that he requests that his hands don't even be tied to the spike. He thinks, I can stand the flames and I can handle this on my own. And he utters this magnificent phrase where he says, 85 years I have served my God. Why would he fail me now? And I think that attitude is really important when we talk about preservation, persecution, how we withstand trials and temptations. And that's, I think, a little bit of what you see happening here in Daniel chapter 3. We're going to end up reading this whole chapter, but we're going to take it obviously piece by piece. Look in Daniel, the 3rd chapter, starting verse 1. It says, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of provinces, essentially anybody that was important, were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. They stood before the image, and then the herald loudly proclaimed, verse 4, to you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. There's a couple of things that I think are noteworthy about this that we oftentimes skip over if we're not too careful. The first one being is that this is not an empire-wide admonition. If you look later in Daniel chapter 6, that one is more or less everybody. Daniel's a part of that, obviously, but it's really kind of everybody. There's obviously a specific trap laid, but this is just for the higher-ups. We'll get into the specific position Shadrach, Meschach, and Abed-Nego held in a minute, but this is really just for the higher-ups. And the whole point of this situation is to demonstrate by these people who are in these positions of authority, who are you loyal to? Are you loyal to Nebuchadnezzar? He's, after all, the conquering king who imported all of these people, placed them in high positions by choice. Are you going to be loyal to them or him? Or are you still going to retain your old customs that you had in your previous one? That's really the question that's going forth here. And I've personally always wondered why Daniel is not included in this. You don't see Daniel anywhere here in Daniel chapter 3. But he's obviously not the main character of at least this story. His will come later. In verse 7 it says, therefore at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. For this reason, verse 8, at that time certain Chaldeans came and brought forth charges against the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever, which is a great way to butter anybody up. You, O king, have made a decree. Remember that? That every man who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, is to fall down and worship the golden image. Whoever, verse 11, remember this, Nebuchadnezzar, whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast in the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meschach, and Abed-Nego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods, nor worship your golden image, which you yourselves have set up. Make no mistake about what's actually taking place in this situation. What's happening here in this moment is a full-on character assassination to Shadrach, Meschach, and Abed-Nego. There's no doubt about it. As a matter of fact, you can almost get the same sense that the people had in Daniel chapter 6, when after they implored Darius to set up this decree, they're kind of watching from their window to see what Daniel is going to do. That is stated explicitly there in Daniel chapter 6. Same thing is taking place here in Daniel chapter 3. Because after they set this idol up, after this thing is erected, they know these three men are not going to bow the knee towards this idol. And so they use this situation of the fiery furnace as a way to eliminate people who are most likely their direct competitors for career advancement. That sounds very 21st century. But keep in mind that in Daniel chapter 2, Shadrach, Meschach, and Abed-Nego are put specifically in the administration of the province of Babylon. They are, in modern terms, the mayors of Washington, D.C. Do they hold any federal power? No. But they command the local assets on the ground where the seat of power actually is in place. That's essentially the position they hold. And so these men are looking at Shadrach, Meschach, and Abed-Nego, and they're using this fiery furnace as an opportunity to basically eliminate all of them, because they know that the integrity of these men is set in stone. Verse 13, Nebuchadnezzar in rage and anger gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meschach, and Abed-Nego. Then these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meschach, and Abed-Nego, that you do not serve my gods, you don't worship the golden image that I've set up? Now if you are ready," which I love how he just kind of prepares them for this, "if you're ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the trigon, the psaltery, the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, if you're ready to fall down and worship the image that I've made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will be immediately cast in the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there," this is the key phrase from Nebuchadnezzar's standpoint, "what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meschach, and Abed-Nego, verse 16, replied back to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of the blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even," highlight or underline, this is a great phrase, "even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods. We are not going to worship the golden image that you have set up." I love that phrase from these three men, because what it essentially says is they're very unimpressed with the king's standing. They don't care about the fiery furnace. They don't care about the destruction. What it shows is that their faith, and this is really important to the understanding of faith in general, their faith is not dependent on present circumstances. Sometimes that is how persecution affects us. We allow present circumstances to dictate how we're going to respond in certain scenarios, but as we'll find out here in a second, these men don't need any kind of prep work. Go light the fire up now. I don't care. Because no matter what you do, no matter what threats you have, that's not going to change the stance I've already taken. It's very ironic that when you look in Old Testament literature, and you look in secular literature around the time period of the Chaldeans, the main reason that people used to be burned was for blasphemy. And so here you have Nebuchadnezzar charging these three men essentially with one of the highest counts of either treason or blasphemy, probably both baked in there together. And yet they're standing for the only true God that can protect them from this flame. Verse 19. Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered towards Shadrach, Meschach, and Abed-Nego. He answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meschach, and Abed-Nego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. I've always wondered how you do that. I am not, as I've said several times, I'm not a scientist. But I've always wondered how you take something like a fire and you make it 7 times hotter than you always have. I always think of it, and this is probably way off track, I always think of it like Back to the Future 3, where Doc Brown takes those different colored logs and throws them in there and it heats the train up. Maybe that's what's happening here. But I did a little research into the way that this furnace was probably constructed. And it's very similar to, and I know Jeff and Cody will understand this immediately, it's very similar to how a big green egg or a big green egg operates. If you're familiar with that, if you're not, you can call Crumpton TV. They have them on sale, 903-566. But the way that these eggs operate is you have 2 airflows. You have your meat there in the middle, you have airflow at the top, airflow at the bottom. You measure the airflow to determine how much air, oxygen, is going to come in, light the fire even hotter, and smoke or grill, whatever it is that you're doing. And so if you have something like this scenario, what you have is you have a big furnace that is designed to bake bricks, which has to get upwards of 800,000 degrees in order to make these bricks. You have essentially a big fan over the top that you would pull back, in order to amplify the heat that is inside the furnace, which is why when Nebuchadnezzar is looking, he can look directly into it because the furnace is that direction. You have to go up and drop them into it. That's essentially what happened here. And even the next verse that you have immediately after that, where these valiant men go up and throw them into it, that's exactly how that operates. If you've ever lifted the lid on a grill too fast and that heat comes down and singes the arm on your, or the hair on your forearm, true story by the way, you know how dangerous something like this is. And so that's essentially how this system operates. No wonder why these people were killed, why Nebuchadnezzar was so mad. Continue on in the story. These men, verse 21, were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, their other clothes, and they were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. For this reason, verse 22, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-Nego. That's what we just read. But these three men, verse 23, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-Nego fell into the midst of the furnace. That's what I talked about, throwing them in from the top down to the bottom. Fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. He said to his high officials, was it not three men we cast in the midst of the fire? They replied to the king, certainly. And he said, look, I see four men loosed. So obviously these three men that were thrown in were untied and were then walking around, verse 25, without harm. And the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire, and he responded and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-Nego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-Nego came out of the midst of the fire. The satraps, the prefects, the governors, the king's high officials, they gathered around, the same people that accused them of this, they gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect of the bodies on these men, nor was the hair of their head even singed, nor was their trousers damaged, nor did they even have the smell of fire come upon them. There's literally zero trace of this event ever happening. Nebuchadnezzar, verse 28, responded and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-Nego, who has sent his angel, delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command, yielded up their bodies, so as not to serve or to worship any god except their own God. That's a statement of their perseverance. Therefore I have made a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-Nego shall be torn limb from limb. Their house is indeed reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. The king then, verse 30, caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-Nego to prosper in the province of Babylon. I find it interesting that the whole gist, the whole aim of this entire setup was in order to eliminate these people, and yet what happens at the end is not only are they promoted, but they're made even more rich than they were to begin with. And you can almost imagine the accusers of these people who are sitting there are a lot like the conniving Pharisees that looked at the crucifixion of Jesus, the resurrection. They saw the burgeoning Christian faith, and they thought, this is the exact opposite of what we wanted. And yet that's really what perseverance does, doesn't it? Is that perseverance has this multiplying effect, where when you see somebody standing up for something, even if it's something you disagree with, you can't help but be impressed at least. And at least you take away from that a little bit of resolve and a little bit of understanding about what they have down to their very core. And I think there are some very real lessons that you can pull from this entire story that I did not learn in my second grade Bible class, which is totally fine because I was still, as I said, trying to pronounce their names. But I think there are some very real lessons that you can pull away from this. The first one that I would tell you is that their faith was formed before the fire. I think sometimes when we talk about perseverance, we talk about faith and development of faith, we oftentimes think about it in terms of, well, when I get there, then I'll stand strong. And I would encourage everybody to honestly take a deep evaluation of their faith. You can do it now, you can do it this afternoon, you can do it later. But I would encourage everyone to take a deep evaluation of their faith and really ask yourself, are you preparing for the fires that lay ahead? There's a story that, I don't know where it began. It's been told, retold, and probably abused 1,000 times. But it's the story of the pot or the frog that is in a pot of boiling water. And you're probably familiar with this story. The frog is put into a thing of water at medium temperature, and it doesn't realize that the heat is going up by the second. And so the frog stays in the pot, and they slowly increase the temperature on the water. The frog doesn't realize how hot it's getting, and before long, the frog eventually boils to death because he doesn't really realize how hot that water is getting. It's that slow type of death. And I think a similar situation occurs with us. We don't realize, number one, how much the things around us are intensifying to the point that we're not preparing for it. But number two, we greatly overestimate our own abilities to stand firm in the faith. And we think, yeah, if they come up to me and they say, why don't you bow down to this idol? Or Satan comes up like he does in Matthew chapter 4 and say, bow down to Satan. I'll stand up to that. And yet we have these little moments of weakness throughout our lives that totally betray any of that stance. If you look in Daniel chapter 1, this was not a decision that they made in Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 1, starting in verse 8. This is right at the beginning of this whole narrative. Daniel chapter 1, starting in verse 8, says, Daniel made up his mind. This is another fantastic phrase. Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commanders of the officials that they may not defile himself. Now God, verse 9, granted Daniel the favor and the compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, here's the little pseudo-test. He says, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has appointed your food and your drink. This is the micro-allegiance. Are you going to eat the food, or are you not going to eat the food? That's really important at this point. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. Daniel then said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed, over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. That's the three friends from Daniel chapter 3. Test your servants, verse 12. For 10 days let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. The king then said, I'm chapter 2 now. Let our appearance, verse 13, be observed in your presence, in the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. I think it's interesting that a couple chapters before Daniel chapter 3 even exists, you have almost the exact same scenario in a drastically scaled down situation. Same test of allegiance. Are you going to follow the new people or not? Are you going to do what I ask you to do, or are you not going to do? And yet it all revolves around the choice of food. And yet the entire narrative in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8 begins with the statement, I have made up my mind. And to that I ask you the question. I ask myself the question. Have I made up my own mind? When moments of trial and persecution and things that are in the distance that I know will eventually reach my doorstep in some capacity, have I decided now the stand that I'm going to make 20, 30, 40 years down the road? Because the wrong time to establish that foundation is when you're in the middle of everything. If you look at Luke chapter 16, starting verse 10, we'll just go there right now. If you look at Luke chapter 16, starting verse 10, you see Jesus kind of preparing for this. And I really just wanted to read this whole chapter. We already read Daniel chapter 3, so we don't have time to read all of it, but I would encourage you to do that. Luke chapter 16, starting verse 10, cuts right to the meat of the matter. Because in verse 10, he says, he who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. He who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the use of unrighteous wealth, who will entrust the true riches to you? And if you have not been faithful in the use of that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? We look at that sometimes and we think, well, that's great financial advice, because after all, if you can't manage the money you have now, and this is a little bit of what Solomon says in Ecclesiastes, then why would you ever be entrusted with all these riches later? Because you've obviously mismanaged what's happening. And that's exactly the way that Paul looks at the eldership in 1 Timothy chapter 5. When he asks the question, can they even take care of their own home? Because if they can't take care of their home and they can't raise that in the way, if it's constantly a mess and there's chaos and there's disrespect and there's anger, then you can't shepherd the church of God. And that's the same scenario that we see here in this passage. If we can't be faithful in something like Daniel 1 with food, then what makes us think that we can be faithful when we're staring the king of the empire in the face and saying that we are not going to bow down to those situations? What this ultimately does in Daniel chapter 3 is it neutralizes the impulse decisions. I know exactly how this operates. When me and Levi go to Costco, for instance, Winnie gives me a very specific list. It is composed of 7 different things. I promise you with the utmost certainty that is not what's in my cart when I leave. Because when I look at that situation, when we walk through Costco, I eventually see the snacks. I see the sweatpants, which are awesome, by the way. If you haven't seen Costco sweatpants, I would encourage you to check those out. Levi will inevitably grab something without me noticing, and now all of a sudden it's in the cart. But that's what happens sometimes with shopping lists, is you look at this and you think, well, I'm going to go in, I'm going to do this is how it's going to operate. But then your impulses betray you. And that's why it's important to form that faith before the situation ever arises. Forget Costco and how silly an example that may be, and think about something much more dramatic in terms of like an active shooter situation. I'm not going to go into the details of this because I don't want to talk about too much detail, but the wrong time to form, as people here will tell you, the wrong time to form an active shooter plan is when there's an active shooter taking place. And you can extrapolate this to all different types of things. If we don't form our faith before the fire even begins, then we are not going to stand before Nebuchadnezzar and say that we won't bow before him. In contrast to the faith of Shadrach, Meschach, and Abed-Nego, you also see the example of Nebuchadnezzar. We talked about this a second ago. Go back to Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2, I would argue that Nebuchadnezzar has rocky faith. And when I say that, I'm not just saying his faith is on the rocks. I'm alluding to the parable of the soils. Jesus talks about this. When the soil goes on the seed rather, goes on 4 different types of soil, you have the one that is taken immediately by the birds. You have the one that falls on good soil, multiplies. You have the one that is choked up by thorns. But the rocky soil, I think, most exactly fits what Nebuchadnezzar has. Because when Jesus talks about this parable of the rocky soil, what he essentially says is that the seed springs up because it has no depth of soil, and it's great, it's magnificent, but there's not really any depth. There's no foundation. And if there's no foundation to the soil itself, then that faith isn't going to last longer than 10 minutes. Look at the end of Daniel chapter 2. This is not the first time that Nebuchadnezzar interacts with these types of people. Daniel chapter 2, starting verse 46, it says, King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face. This is after the idol that is interpreted by Daniel. King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and did homage to Daniel, gave orders to present him an offering of fragrant incense. The king answered Daniel and said, Surely your God is a God of gods, a Lord of kings, a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery. Then the king promoted Daniel, verse 48, gave him many great gifts, and he promoted him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel, then, verse 49, vouched for his friends and made requests to the king, and the king appointed Shadrach, Meschach, and Abed-Nego over the administration of the province of Babylon. We talked about that earlier, while Daniel then was at the king's court. This is not the first time in which Nebuchadnezzar is faced with the king of, or with Jehovah God. This is at least the second of 3 situations in which Nebuchadnezzar is going to be adamantly shown very clearly who Jehovah is. And at the end of Daniel chapter 2, as Nebuchadnezzar is seeing the interpretation of the dream and the details that went into it and the truthfulness of it, he exalts Jehovah. And he says, truly, your God is the revealer of mysteries. It's almost the exact same thing he says at the end of chapter 3. But then you get to Daniel chapter 4, and this is the infamous chapter where Nebuchadnezzar turns into a cow. Some people have said a goat. There's probably somebody that thinks he's an emu. I don't know. He turns into a beast of some kind. Feathers, hair, the whole 9 yards. And the whole point, if you look at Daniel chapter 4, as he mentions there in the first few verses, is to humble Nebuchadnezzar. Well, why does Nebuchadnezzar need to be humbled? He's already been shown twice now, who Jehovah is. And yet, like the rocky soil faith, he had zero foundation. He observed the situation. He saw what was taking place. He immediately has this super emotional response in regards to Jehovah, but it has no foundation. And if you look at Daniel chapter 4, and we won't read all of this, but if you look at Daniel chapter 4, specifically the end of it, go there if you would. The end of Daniel chapter 4. He says almost the exact same thing that he said now in 3 straight chapters. But at the end of that period, verse 34 of Daniel chapter 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards heaven, and my reason returned to me. And I blessed the Most High, praised and honored him who lives forever and ever. For his dominion, verse 34, is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing. But he does according to his will in the host of heavens and among the inhabitants of the earth, and no one can ward off his hand or say to him, what have you done? Here's the question that I leave you with, and this is not something I have an answer, and this is not the end of the sermon. I don't know why I said leave you with. But here's the question that I will leave you with for this week. Do you think Nebuchadnezzar leaned on what he says at the end of Daniel 4? Because he drops off the face of the earth after this chapter. Or do you think he reverts back to his old ways that he had in Daniel's chapter 2 and 3, where he goes right back to this gloating understanding of his own self-importance? What do you think happened to Nebuchadnezzar? I think it'd be easy to look at him and say, well, obviously he learned his lesson, but you could say that after watching 3 guys walk out of the fire. By the time you get to the end of Daniel chapter 4, the question is still there. But regardless, he's somebody who operates purely based on emotion. And I actually pondered this question quite a bit this week because I was constantly thinking, how can somebody who is so is shown the proof of God so clearly, who doesn't just rely on what other people have to say, but has literally seen miracles, has experienced a miracle, how does somebody turn away from that? And the answer, as I soon found out, was based in the parable of the soils, which Jesus says very simply that the seed goes into the soil and it has no root. And if it has no root, there's nothing to support that long term. We see that in today's world all the time. We think to ourselves, well, because I'm here Sunday, because I'm here Wednesdays, because I pray before meals, obviously that means my faith is secure. I hope it is. Trials and temptations and persecutions will test that. But how much farther along do you think your faith would be if you sat down for an hour every day and read the Bible? If you said every single day for a solid hour, for an entire year, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to study Scripture. Do you think that your faith would be more well-rooted at the end of the year? Absolutely. You could do the same with 5 minutes. You could do the same with 10 minutes. Because the key in it is not in the idea of this long time every single day, but in its consistency. And the fact that I'm constantly putting that word further and further and further and further rooted down inside my heart. So that when moments like this show up, I'm not caught on my back foot. I'm not caught unaware. You look at Luke, the 6th chapter, it's the story of the two foundations. And the two foundations is when you have two guys, one builds his house on the rock, one builds his house on the sand. And what both of those two stories have in common, and you see the same thing at the end of Matthew chapter 7, but what both of those stories have in common is both of them plan for some kind of building. That's a metaphor for your faith. It's a metaphor for your perseverance, whatever you want it to be, obviously, spiritual. But only one of them anticipated the storm that was eventually going to come. One thought they were secure, but only one made actual provisions for it by basing their house on the rock. And so I ask you, which one of those are you? Are you somebody who builds your faith on a rock? Are you burying that word deep inside your heart? Or are you somebody who's relying on the minimum quantity to get by? This might be the most controversial thing I'll say, but I would also argue that we need to take the necessary stands only when it's necessary. In today's world, in the world of social media, and especially in a post-COVID world, there are all sorts of people, as we mentioned in class this morning, that just like to fight. There are people who want to go to blows. There are people who want to be confrontational. They want to take everything you say and they want to stand up for it. And ironically, then those same people, when they're counted against, will say back and say, well, I'm just the victim in this whole conversation. That victim mentality only gets you so far. Because what you don't see, at least in the recorded text, is you don't see Shadrach, Meschach, and Abed-Nego complaining about everything. You don't see Daniel pitching a hissy fit about every single thing that shows up, and you know he saw it. But when the moment mattered, when the question on the table was, are you going to worship God or are you not? That's when he quietly took his stand. You see the same type of preparation in the book of Luke. Look at Luke chapter 22. This is in contrast to what you see several chapters earlier in the book of Luke. Earlier in Luke chapter, I don't know the chapter, but earlier in the book of Luke, you have some scenes that unfold where Jesus will talk about not taking a staff. He'll talk about not taking a money bag. Times have changed. Because in Luke chapter 22, starting in verse 28, he says, you are those who have stood, and this is as he's in the upper room, you are those who have stood by me in my trials. And just as my Father has granted me a kingdom, I grant you that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and you will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Simon, Simon, verse 31, behold, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. And that you, when once you have turned again, you will strengthen your brothers. But he said to him, Lord, I am with you, both to ready to go to the prison and death. Well, several hours later, obviously that faith was proven not to be true. Verse 34, he says to him, Peter, I say to you, the rooster will not crow today until you have denied me 3 times. And he said to them, Jesus then talking to his apostles, when I sent you out without money belt and bags and sandals, you didn't lack anything, did you? They said, no. But he said to them, but now whoever has a money belt is to take it along. Likewise also a bag, whoever has no sword is to sell his coat and buy one. For I tell you that this which is written must be fulfilled in me, and he was numbered with the transgressors, for that which refers to me has its fulfillment. Times have changed, haven't they? What Jesus understands, at least in this scenario, is that there are going to be people that will now enter the conversation directly attacking them. They're not pointing at Jesus anymore. He's gone. Resurrected, he ascended. He's not there anymore. Now they're looking at him. They're looking at Thomas. And they're looking at Peter. And they're looking at Simon. And those are the people who are going to bear the brunt of those flames. And so Jesus makes the only rational explanation he could, which is, if you don't have a sword, you need to get one. If you don't have a money bag, you need to get one. If you don't have a second robe, you need to get one. And that's not saying that they need to go on the warpath, but what he is saying is you need to be prepared, because when those fires show up at your doorstep, you have got to be willing to stand. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 18, Paul lays out literally the entire armor of God and ends it by saying, after you have done everything, the most important thing is to stand. We don't fight and make up arguments just to fight. We don't create this victim mentality when it's not necessary. But when the fires are there, take the necessary stance when it's necessary. And so I'll ask you this morning as we end, are you willing and ready to make those stands? It will not always come in the form of a massive idol. As a matter of fact, I don't think it'll ever come in the form of a massive idol. But are you willing, am I willing to take the moments that test our faith, actually test our faith, and stand up to those fires? Are we really as prepared as we think we are? Have we really rooted the Word deep inside of our heart? Or are we fooling ourselves? I would encourage you to make that decision. Think about it deeply as we stand and as we sing.